I would like to start the first panel with Víctor Magaña from UNAM. The panel is called Dynamics and Context for Water. I don't know if we can show Victor on screen.
¿Me escuchan?
Can you hear me? Can you see me? Hi, good morning. We can hear you, but some people say that they cannot see you. Well, it's not important that you see me. It's important that you see my presentation. I don't know if you can turn up the volume, and meanwhile, I would like to introduce you. You are a member of the intergovernmental panel from the IPPC for climate change, main researcher in the Institute of Geography in UNAM, a scientific counselor for preventing disasters in the meteorological area. You have been able to highlight a very important academic formation in sciences and atmospheric sciences, a robust experience that shows all the contributions and dynamics from the climate change in the tropical Americas and the meteorological phenomena in Mexico. With your knowledge and saying thank you for being here, I pass you the floor so that you tell us how you view this, and in the end, there will be questions from the attendees in this conference room and from Zoom. Well, I don't know if I need to show the presentation or you are going to show the presentation there. I'm not sure how that works. If you allow me to share the screen, I can do that. Yes, of course, whatever is easier for you. Okay, then I'm going to share the screen. I don't know if you see my screen now. Yes, we can see your screen. Okay, my name is Víctor Magaña. I am researcher from the National University of Mexico, and for many years I have worked in matters that have to do with the climate, not only in Mexico but also in the tropical Americas. One of the most important interests in my career has to do with understanding which are the signals of the climate and its natural variations and or climate change provoked by men. Especially because oftentimes I am concerned with the information provided by the media, and I think that there's some exaggeration that everything is climate change and produced by the climate change. So, well, I try to do attribution exercise. Especially, I will talk about the climate and I will talk about water, and you will see how the two things have to do with our understanding. I sustain that the climate change is being blamed for everything, and to justify some of the mistakes that we have. Let me remove this bar because probably you see this bar, the lower bar, but it's not visible. Okay, now I think that you can see. And as I said before, I'm going to talk about the climate. So this implies observing over the observation, which is something that we have done for a long time. Now we know that observation shows how the climate gets warm or warms up, and I think that we have done less to understand, and that's why we have skipped the observation of the climate, and then we started with forecast of the climate with very negative scenarios for everything. And after that, we have provided what climate information, analysis of consequence, and answer options. All that I heard in the morning about adaptation and someone talking about knowing enough to adapt is to be a question. I think that we need to do more, and it's very important if we need to mitigate and adequately adapt. And here you can see a very simple analysis on average the whole temperature of the country, And we can see in the case of the temperature has been increased or has increased, we can ask ourselves any question how we can see these peaks and these drops in the case of Mexico. I want you to pay attention to the lower graph. This is the precipitation rate in Mexico. And you can see that there are some drops and raises and drops and raises. That means that we haven't had a trend, even though we have determined that there's a trend to more rain. And this is part of the things that we don't understand. We have a very clear idea on what's going on, but for the same reason, people say that in this last year we have a very important drop, and then everything is considered that this is caused by climate change. But the climate change needs to be understood as a long-term trend. There are some seasons in which there's a lot of rain, and there's seasons in which there is not enough precipitation. If we make a map using all the information from the National Institute of Water in Mexico, we can see the trend in the last 60 years about precipitation. In the country, there's more rain, with exception of Yucatan. If you ask me why, there is a negative trend in precipitation in Yucatan. I think that it has to do with all that happens in the Caribbean. It's in all the Caribbean. We know by our observation what's going on, but we don't understand the process. In terms of temperature, you can see the climate change says that the temperatures are rising in all the country, especially in the north and in the northeast, and this smaller portion from the Yucatan Peninsula. In very simple words, we can say that if there's more rain and more temperature, how many water then do we get at the end? To understand that, we have used different sources to understand the trend in the availability of water. And what we can see is that in the north of the country, both for shallow water and underground water, there has a negative trend. Like the Yucatan Peninsula, there's not much water either. And meanwhile, in this section, probably because there is more rain than in the past, we can see that there is more availability. Then why don't I get enough water at home? That has to do with the management of the water. If you analyze the impact on vegetation, for example, a moment ago, it was mentioned that this is linked to what's going on with the forest and the climate change. The climate determines where there's to be vegetation, but the vegetation can also determine where there's climate. These considerations are very complex and not basic. Most surprisingly, in recent years, and by this I mean that the last 4 years, we have seen a country, and not only a country, but also a planet that tends to be greener. The satellite shows that there is more green, more vegetation in all this zone, with the exception of some areas in the northeast, these areas that are deserts or semi-arid. And then you can ask yourself, why are we highlighting the negative part and that is against the positive part? Then you would say that climate change is affecting all the green and all the vegetation in the planet, and it's the opposite. The ecologists and people that study cell physiology analyze why the planet is green. Why? Because of the CO2, because there's a higher temperature in the atmosphere. This is not a trivial question, and then we need to address it. Just for you to have an idea, and I will try to do this fast because I don't have enough time. Whenever we talk about climate change, we only think of the negative effects. In the previous slide, I was showing you that there's more vegetation and more green areas. The other negative part about climate change that we are always told is that production of food, for example, the main food for Mexico is corn, is lowering its production. And if we use the most recent information, I mean official information, what then you find is that in the last century, in more than 100 years, Mexico produces more and more corn. In here you can see that there's a long-term trend shown in both production and performance. is on the rise. Of course, we have periods in which this trend seems to be stopped and decreases, and these are all the values that have to do with droughts. However, at a production level, we produce much more, and I don't only mean about the use of water, but I mean also that we can produce more by seasons, and this has to do with the season. In terms of climate change, and not in terms of individual droughts, in terms of climate change, turns out to be favorable besides other things, and this is important. Likewise, you could think of the availability of water and climate change. This is an example of the San Fernando River. And I use this example for the following reason. I use the information about the precipitation. This is a continuous line. There are different variations. There are dry years, there are humid years. When there's a tropical cyclone, then we have a lot of water. When we don't have cyclones, it's true dry. But you can notice that this in this period, at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 2000s, there's a constant of precipitation and the flow of the river drops. We can see or understand by this that the climate in terms of rain is not what determines the flow. Both in agriculture and in shallow waters, there's something that we call management. And when we talk about the water and the climate, we need to talk about the management. If we have done it well or if we have done it wrongly, we will see this reflected in the conditions of water in Mexico. For example, in here, we might see that in this particular year was a drought and meteorological drought year. However, this trend to less water is something that we might consider a hydrological drought. They are different, and they are different because since as the climate drought is something not natural, the other one shows the meteorological chances of a drought and also with the management of water. And this is something that I think we are missing to understand how we can add this knowledge on the climate to better understand factors that affect us as much as the drought. When you see the news and the media, they talk about drought no matter what. There's a drought, and then you think that we can manage it or understand it and measure it because based on the number of dry crops or dead animals. But we need to go back to the data in order to understand the processes. And when we talk about the impacts, for example, when someone was talking about this before, and about the portioning of water. Of course, there might be a drought, which is the natural danger, the meteorological drought. However, there are other factors that we consider about vulnerability, considering the management infrastructure, the culture of water, and they all combined become a risk of hydrological, agricultural drought, as we can see in the cities. If we just refer to that, to the part that has to do with the climate and the variations of the climate, then we are forgetting all of these other components that have to do with the management of the resources. However, this gives us the chance to correct this in order to decrease the level of the risk despite the dangers like the meteorological drought, and we can count with water. And in this case, we need to understand what adaptation is about. We cannot only talk about general terms and then I'm going to adapt to climate change. We need to be wider and we need to be much more specific. I'm going to adapt to what? To the drought episodes, to the very intense storm, tropical cyclones, and each of them needs a specific strategy. We need to be careful. The speech looks nice, but we need to be careful when you put this into practice. I have worked with the states in different adaptation plans and climate actions, and then I noticed that we are haven't understood many different things. So you should know everything to
En,
start acting. We can start
una de las
acting with
cosas
the information we
que
already
llama la
understand.
atención son las
Something
famosas
that is in
inundaciones.
everybody's
Esto en
minds
el
is
2011
drought.
y estaban
This
paralizando
was
en el
this
norte
dates
de
back
México lo mismo.
to
Hemos
2011,
aprendido
and in the
mucho de
north of
cómo
Mexico we had
funciona
the
la
same issue.
sequía,
We have
cómo
understood the
funcionan
droughts
estas
and
variaciones.
how these
Recuerden que son
variations
debido a
work.
números, pero
Sorry
también
if the
debido a
numbers are not
corrientes
clear,
y
but they
vortexes.
read
Haber
2020,
entendido
2030,
estas
2040, and so
oscilaciones
on.
en la parte
So
climática con
understanding the
diferentes
oscillations in the
frecuencias
climate
nos
with
ha ayudado a
different
saber cuándo
frequencies
podemos
has
tener
led us to know
precipitaciones.
how, when we
Pero
can suffer one of
experimentamos
these
cuándo las
droughts.
tenemos no
But
significa que
understanding when we
actuemos.
might happen doesn't mean
Termina
that we
siendo solamente
actually
una
act or
cuestión
react.
anecdótica o de
This is just like
estimación
an
de
anecdote
qué
or a
debería ser así.
justification.
La humedad que llega a México llega de muchos
Humidity coming to
lugares.
Mexico
Sin
comes from
embargo,
many
no hemos
different
hecho todo
places,
lo
and
necesario para aprender
we
cómo
haven't done everything necessary
cómo
to
viene la temporada de
learn
lluvias. Hemos
and to
avanzado
understand
en
the rain
cuestiones, por
season.
ejemplo, como el
We
periodo de
have
lluvia,
made some progress to
pero no
understand
significa que
things like
conocemos
El
ese
Nino. That
conocimiento lo
doesn't
tenemos
mean that we
para tomar
use the
acciones
knowledge
de
from the from El Nino
emergencia.
to
La
prevent
falta de
or to
políticas
and this
del
has to do
Consejo
with the
Nacional del
policies. The
Agua,
National
la
Commission of Water,
Semarnat en general,
Semarnat in
la
general,
Secretaría de Gobernación,
the
Secretaría de
Secretary of the
Agricultura,
Government, the
bueno, no
Agriculture
toman
Secretary, they
de
don't
forma
use
verdaderamente
this
seria
information
a sus planes
seriously, and they don't
anuales
include this
de
information
lluvias.
in their annual plans
El
to say,
pronóstico
okay,
y el
the
conocimiento
forecast and
científico
the scientific
te
knowledge
dicen que este año
say
puede ser un
that
año
this
muy
year
seco.
might be a very dry
Por
year.
lo tanto, vamos a
And for
comenzar
that
con una
reason, we will
gestión del
start a
agua
different management
incluso
of
desde que
water
lleguemos a las
before we
calificaciones.
get
Sin
crisis
embargo,
conditions.
la historia de
However, the
México es una
history of
historia de un
Mexico
país
is a
que responde
history
al
of a
desastre,
country that
no
responds to
previene al
disasters,
desastre,
but
responde al
doesn't prevent the
desastre.
disaster.
Tenemos
It
un Centro
responds to
Nacional
disaster. We have a
de
national
Prevención de
center to
Desastres que
prevent
no previene
disaster that
desastres,
doesn't actually prevent
sino que
disasters,
explica.
but instead
Es
justifies
cierto,
them.
hemos
And I
dicho, si
think that
queremos pasar a la etapa
if
de
we want to
adaptación,
move on
nuestras
and
instituciones
to
tienen
adapt,
que
our
pasar
institutions
a
need
realmente tener
to
confianza en esto. Necesitamos
trust this information.
entendemos
We need to
que
understand,
prevenir nos puede ahorrar
and
10 pesos,
that prevention
10
can
pesos de
save us
prevención, nos puede
10
ahorrar
pesos.
10
10
pesos
pesos
de
of prevention can
desastre. Es decir,
save us 10
tener
pesos
todo
of
eso en plan.
recovery from disaster.
La
And besides that, it's a good
2023, por
business.
ejemplo,
By
sin
2023,
haber
the
niño,
forecast says that
la
there would
historia
be
nos dice que
El
cuando no hay
Nino,
niño la condición
and
tiende a ser seca,
when there's El Nino,
entonces la
the conditions
condición
tend to
es
be
seca
dry.
y
In
esto está
2023, the
previniendo
conditions were dry.
el
And if you
millón
ask me, and this is
de
probably
nieve,
part of my
pero no
ignorance of what the
significa que
government
no hizo
does,
nada para
I would tell you
prevenirlo.
that the
Y esto nos
government
habla
didn't
de
do
que hay
anything to
deber por lo
prevent.
menos de
And
parte del
we had
gobierno.
this information
La
since
sequía
2021.
sigue teniendo
We had a drought that
consecuencias
still shows
concretas.
consequences
Les
up
pongo
to
un
this
ejemplo.
date. Let me show you
Hace
another example.
casi un año, en junio del
Almost 1 year ago,
2023,
in June
tuvimos una
2023,
onda de
we
calor
had a
que
heat
si no
wave
exagero,
that if
sumó como un mes de onda de calor,
it
la más
was
extrema en
about
gran
1 month,
parte de todo el país.
extreme heat in
Y de
most of the country.
inmediato,
And
también con
immediately,
esa respuesta de bote pronto,
and
como siempre la
just
tuvimos,
like giving
lo
a
primero que se dijo es cambio
very
climático.
quick answer,
Se dijo
everybody said,
que
okay, that's happened
fue
because of
El
the climate
Lo
change.
tercero que
Others
se
said,
dijo
ah,
fue
it
la
was El Nino.
oscilación del
Others
clima.
said, okay, it was oscillation
Eso
in
pasa cuando no
precipitation.
usa uno
And
la
it happens
ciencia,
when
¿no?
you
No
don't
voy a
use
meterme a
science.
explicar
I'm
esto,
not
no
going
tengo
to
que ver
explain
con
this,
cambio
but this didn't
climático,
have
con
to
El
do with
Niño,
climate
con
change or El
Mar y
Nino
lluvia, con lo que
or
sea.
Mar and Julia or
Tuvo
whatever
que
you
ver con
call
la
it. It
variación
had to
natural
do
que
with
nos
natural
bloqueó fuera del
variations
sistema,
that
que no permitía que la
from a
humedad que
system that
normalmente
didn't
podría entrar a
allow
México
humidity that
entrara.
usually comes into
Tuvimos
Mexico
cero
to
humedad,
actually
cero
enter Mexico.
lluvias,
We had zero rains, we had zero
constituyeron la verdad
humidity,
un
and that
gran
provoked
déficit
during
de
the whole
lluvia en
year
todo el
a
país.
great deficit of
Tuvieron
rain in
además
the
una
whole country.
consecuencia
And
cielos
as a
tan
consequence,
despejados
there
que la
were
humedad
so clear
adicional se
skies
acumulaba y
that
la
the
humedad
amount of
alta
solar radiation was so
resistía
high
el calor
that we
extremo.
felt a
Esto
very
no,
extreme
no es
heat.
cambio climático, es un
This is
proceso
not climate
natural,
change.
solo
This
tratamos
is
de
a natural
explicarlo.
process,
Y
and
esto
this
lo
is something
podríamos
that
haber
we try to
prevenido,
explain.
podríamos
But this could
haberlo
have
hecho
been
más
foreseen,
experto.
and we could have done something with
Se
a better
inventaron
monitoring.
esta cosa que se llama monitor de sequía de América del
There's
Norte.
a
Rueda
North
apareció
American drought
porque con
monitor,
frecuencia
and I
escuchamos,
said this
y esto
because
para
we
mí es muy
often
curioso,
listen about this monitoring
escuchamos
issue. We
que
often
el
hear
90%
that
del país está en
90% of the
situación de
country
sequía,
is
¿no?
in some level of drought.
Y
This was
repetir las
also
cosas sin
repeated
entenderlas
before.
a veces
and repeating the things without understanding them only spreads this misinformation. This is a drought monitor from February 2024, and you can see that most of the country is in red. However, if the people were more careful and read with more care what this drought monitor means, there's a deficit of the rains or meteorological droughts, but it also includes the deficit of water levels in shallow bodies, hydrological droughts that has to do with management of the dams, vegetation, the anomalies in vegetation that are related to the response and probably with agricultural issues and the opinion of the experts. But to be honest, I don't know who the experts are. This gives us this result. The whole country is dry, and that and the media use this information, and many other people use this information to say that we are living a very important drought. However, if you pay attention to the actual precipitation, the precipitation is and the lack of precipitation is over here, and this blue section means that there has been rain or enough rain. The meteorological drought is over here and the rest not so much. So why do we see this red map? Well, because there's a wrong management of water, and that's where we need to pay attention to. How do we use this information to manage our resources? And this is the signal in terms of a green of a vegetation, and the satellite confirms that there has been rain over here, and where there has not been rain, it looks drier. Now, in this final part, I want to show you how the trend changes in the rain. And I added this information because I know that many talk about the conditions of water in Mexico, the droughts, the Cutzamala, and these are the trending topics. And this is a very political thing and it stops being scientific. I want to show you this first chart in order for you to have a clear idea on climate and water, and you can see the level of precipitation by the end of the 19th century and up to 2010. And what you can see is that the trend of the yearly precipitation, and these are the pink bars, there's an increase and there's more rain in summer because the storms are more frequent. 30 millimeters or more storms. So we're living in a country and in a city, for those who live in Mexico City, where there's more rain every time. However, these droughts that can lead us to not having water in other years would have been a very good year. So when we think of the climate change, we think that the climate change is not giving us more water, but it's the other way around. The point is that we are so many, or the country or the population has grown so much that no matter how much it rains, the water will be not enough. So if you see, for example, the case of the Cutzamala dam case, and this is just a reference, and I took this information that is like not so good, but you can see clearly is that when you put this information about the dams, you can see that the rain in these regions always has oscillations, and this year and the past year we went to the low part of the oscillation. This is not weird, we have lived this in previous year. However, the main question is, why was this year so critical? Because the danger was very big, but the context of vulnerability is the one that has been that has increased. If we don't have the right infrastructure and we request more water, we don't repair the things that we need to repair, then we become more vulnerable. Then the socioeconomic drought it affect us much more, and even review the term of green and how the green or the vegetation was like around the dams of Villa Victoria and Valle de Bravo and El Bosque. And of course, there's lots of vegetation in the surrounding, for example, in Valle de Bravo. but I don't really understand this logic. And probably the main example of a socioeconomic drought that I can show you is this one, is the case of Monterrey. In Monterrey, by 2021 or 2022, they lived a very important drought. And before that, we made a study where we showed this with this chart the situation. The green bars show the yearly precipitation. So you could say that since the 40s and up to now, there's a trend to have more precipitation than 100 or 80 years ago. So everything looks great, but the water consumed can be found in dams like El Cuchillo, and with the climate change, the water evaporates. But the information of evaporation gives a negative trend. So there's less evaporation if it's true, the temperature increases, but our explanation is that the levels of humidity in the atmosphere rise in such a way that there's a decrease of evaporation. That's a physical process. And this is the natural danger that needs to be understood. These are the trends: less rain, more evaporation. This is like good news about climate change for Monterrey. But when we analyze the context of vulnerability and you see the blue points, these blue points have to do with the growth of the population in Monterrey, in the main area, in the metropolitan area, in the last 50 years. So it reaches almost 5 million people. And despite the authorities trying to respond to this growing population, with more water supply, the speed of this growth is not the speed with which the demands grow, that in this case are represented by the population. Finally, these red points show when there was a big structure of water to provide water to the population in Monterrey. And what you can see is that in the 50s, and of course this has to do with historical reasons, there were infrastructure, and in this point infrastructures stopped, and there's no more infrastructure from that point on to the main area of Monterrey. And when they realized about the emergency, then they started a new connection for El Cuchillo. This shows how this is a risk, where we have a dangerous situation when we are facing a drought. However, this was a very important drought, but more importantly, this vulnerability condition. And in here, we need to consider the concept of adaptation. And this concept of adaptation reduces the risk and the chances for us to have a disaster. Finally, I want to show you this that looks to me like a very important topic, and probably this was the topic in the morning. And I think that from the point of view of from a climate scientist, this is something difficult to understand. I took this piece of news that was not about a specific place, and with more deforestation, less rain. So in here, people couple the problem of rain and forest. Less rain. When we analyze the trends of rain for Mexico, from 1979 to 2008, we find that in the case of this Guatemala zone from the Petén, the trend was really negative. So there was less rain, and this not only measured by station and satellites. And we were asking ourselves, is this real or is this a mistake in our analysis? And then when we analyzed this zone where there was a decrease of rain, what we could actually found that there was a coincidence with this zone where there has been important deforestation that has to do with forestation.
However, this area experiences a change with less manpower. Um, the resulting crisis with societal impacts and migration. Mexico isn't an exception to this. We will need to assess this further, but this is no straightforward solution. I mean, we need to take it with a grain of salt in terms of adapting. So we'll move on to the conclusions. We've learned a lot about climate and water. So I think things could be done better if we could learn to seize climate and meteorological information. But because we're not so used to planning and risk analysis, we always fall short. What if it doesn't happen? Well, there are appropriate ways to go about it, even in spite of the uncertainty. This is why sometimes I'm shocked. Oh, we're going to adapt ourselves to climate change by 2040. There is greater uncertainty, even versus a yearly basis, and yet they discuss planning and adapting under 6 months. There is a lot to collaborate with our European partners. They have a lot of experience in forecasting. We have a lot of experience in terms of vulnerability assessment, and we can come up with new ideas from within CONAGUA. And so, yes, CONAGUA must include climate, but and strengthening this in practice, not only on paper, in terms of meteorological services on a local level and water management systems. All of this understanding needs to be translated into public policy making, in domestic laws on climate change and water management. All of that should be included in the legislation and in action in terms of territory appropriate management, because territory can have a great deal of influence on local climate, including rain processes. So this is the end of my talk. Hopefully you'll ask yourselves a lot of questions for further discussion. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Because of time constraints, we won't avail the question and answer session, but if there are any questions, we can take a note of it and we can forward to you via email. We're gonna take notes of this. Yeah, because yeah, we need to go about risk assessment, better governance, and how this can influence public policy making. What are we going to adapt to? That's the question. Thank you for your presentation. We're going to take notes of any and all questions, and we're going to move forward with the following speech. David Smith, he's already online, so would you mind just putting it on screen so that we can begin introducing him? David Smith is the head of a water environment and business for developments a company. He's got a degree by the University of Cape Town, a master's degree in water management and the environment at the UK University, a doctorate by the Autonomous University of Barcelona on environmental technology. He has managed a lot of projects on the environment across the world, considering Europe and Mexico, the World Bank, the International Development Bank, and others. So I don't know if you're online, sir. Yeah, I'm here. Oh, thank you, David. We have a lot of people here. You have the floor, and hopefully we can avail for some questions and answers. Thank you for your presentation. Well, can you see my presentation before I get started? Hopefully, so. Otherwise, you'll let me know. So thank you for the invitation. And good evening from Barcelona. I've liked the previous presentation because it discusses quite a great deal on highly key topics to bear in mind. Not only are we dealing with changes which are obvious, and we must not overlook the fact that there are changes we are experiencing, but we also need to have a reality check on the changes and what can be done from those changes and how we can better seize our available resources. So this is what I'm going to discuss with you today, how public policy making and resource management can be improved on some examples from this. Well, these are the items on the agenda I'm going to discuss right now. I'm going to jump into the subject matter and the introduction of it. I'm going to discuss why I can discuss these kinds of topics. Well, the company, the water environment and beyond can focus on that. So all of this on water and the environment, we are specialized in social, economic, and political affairs. So regarding climate change and the circular. So we've discussed throughout many years the chance to work on many countries worldwide, especially in Mexico, where I used to live for 5 years. Actually, it was based in Mexico City. So we started running some projects in Latin America, in Europe, and in Africa. I had the honor to belong to different international groups discussing a number of subject matters and matters related to water. Our spearheading the Water Europe group, not only regarding European policies and their replication into other countries worldwide, and everything that's being implemented as we are discussing. So I have the honor to be a part of MUS, Multiple Use Water Services, on the water supply network. And this is on the rural environment. So in terms of the activities, initiatives, and so on, and collaborations stemming from the European Union, well, from within its borders, right? There are a number of projects stemming from Europe and with an outlook. And so I think as a commission, as the European Commission, we've been managing international relations on water for a few years now. So, for example, in the China Euro Water Platform, this is one of the initiatives which initially was doing well, but then the relations between the two entities, China and Europe, have been worsening quite a great deal. So in 2024, this platform was relaunched, knowing how important it is to learn from both ends, even if the previous platform didn't work out so well. So this is one of the most important things because we've talked about success stories and how well we've done, but I think we need to acknowledge it when companies aren't doing that well, but when, how to learn on those mistakes committed along the way. All right, the in the EU water partnership has been around for a number of years and it works fairly well. So when we are talking about Latin America, the Euro Clima, this is a program that's been around for over 10 years. And this is a program that includes Latin America and the European continent. So not only is this discussing water related topics, but everything that has to do with the environment. On the other hand, there are a number of groups, including economic interest group. Some groups have economic interests or environmental interests, which intertwine themselves as a group, but which is not necessarily stemming from the European Union. And so these kinds of interest groups are around. There are a number of these, but I've only included these examples. The European Commission is tackling international partnerships, especially when it comes to water related issues. So much so that not only does it have a director general focused on all of this, DT International Partnership, but most of the DJs have a component that's related to external operations. So we've looking into cooperating beyond European borders. So in terms of public policies enforced in Europe, which can really be learning from. The key documents by the European Commission on water is a water framework directive. There's a say directive which was launched in the year 2000, so that was 24 years ago. And this was on how to best manage water. That is how water needs to be managed, the kinds of quality limits there are. This is related both related to drinking water and multiple use water, family use water, and wastewater or restroom water. So how to use all of that and how to really realize this. And this was launched 24 years ago. However, in 2019, okay, they decided that because of the fact that we're just accomplishing 20 years of the Water Framework Directive, there is a test missing on whether or not this is valuable versus what we're finding right now. That is, the changes we are experiencing on climate change and a larger number of people because of people displacement or otherwise. And so what they come up with as a result is that the Water Framework Directive across their interactions, well, this is fairly all right because this is on appropriate water management. So this means that there isn't any mystery related to this. We know the water needs per individual and how to treat water before water is being reused. And so at the end of the day, because of the fact that there is no rocket science to it, it's just a matter of implementing this and implementing it well. So when we're talking about doing things right, the European Commission, of course, not only does not always does everything perfectly. So this is where we find ourselves at this impasse. There will be elections at the European Parliament. So in order for it to have new members, each of them have their own speeches and political ideas which they wish to implement. But what happens here? When there's policies, key matters are being neglected. And so these are the pieces of news that are coming to light right now. So, for example, the water resilience plan in Europe used to be a great plan done through a number of niche groups from a number of countries in Europe. And so it turns out that no DG, the environment's DG, so they said they were going just to halt this for a moment. We're going to just wait out on the elections and see what happens afterwards. But there's a lot of pressure for them to do something that's important and that's urgent because, yeah, just now we are needing some guidelines because here in Barcelona, we've been experiencing an important draft for a couple of years now. And so not only are we creating policies on a local level, they're doing quite innovative changes on the what should be doing with water. But these kinds of policies needs to have an overarching policy, and that needs to come from the European Commission. There are nature-based solutions. The European Commission has been doing this for a few years. There's an important way on water. When we are working with, against nature, we see that water is cross-cutting across many subjects. There's also a biodiversity strategy in order for us to improve ecosystem degradation and improve this across countries and landscapes. All of this is embedded into the European Green Deal. This is a document that serves as a guideline across everything that has to do with environmental topics, nature-based solutions, strategies, transportation, green transportation, energy, green energy, renewable energies, and so on. So all of this is pulled into a single document that talks about all of those subject matters with indexes and how to measure those indexes across the document. So I suggest start going through this European Green Deal because I think it's quite very well conceptualized. Now are the successful projects that we are seeing across water, nature-based solutions, and exchanges, collaborations between Mexico, the European Commission, and European countries. One of the topics was Euroclima. and it focuses on several portions because of the fact I knew this program existed. I started looking at the most relevant projects in Mexico with more chances of success. So I've come across this one, which has been coordinated by Pro Natura. It's not that I'm being sponsored by them, but they're the coordinators. So you can go to the Klima website and get to know more about it. However, when you go and ask them, you should ask them, hey, walk me through this forest biodiversity or ecosystem related project and also global agenda articulation from the local agenda. And they'll be able to walk you through that. Another example, which I want to give, is another one where everyone is partaking in. This is project referred to as Natalie. We're talking about nature-based solutions. So this is a huge project, project of cooperation across borders. So the concept everything we're doing with these solutions is supposed to be reaching out the population. So what we're doing is we are putting citizens at the heart of these ideas. So as you can see here, we're talking about social innovation, social and citizen engagement, co-creation and design. So all of this means that solutions are jointly devised to improve all of these areas. So like I said, these are a huge challenge with 43 partners. These are steered by Olio, which is the French Bureau of Water. And so as part of this, there are 8 and they are coordinating with equitable projects in size. So nature-based solutions is a huge project that stems from the European Commission. So they're pushing this massively. The project in and of itself, because of the fact that we are dealing with policies and how to adapt country policies. Well, one of the interesting things that's coming from this, and one of the main goals, is mainstreaming natural-based solutions and naturally determined contributions. So all of this needs to be done per country. Across these contributions, what are the potential synergies that we can find in Mexico and the European Union? A while ago, the European Commission launched an initiative which actually was launched in the UN Water Conference in the US, and it was the first time that the Team Europe was mentioned. This is a way of collaborating. This is a way to have a feel that we are together. However, they saw that there are a lot of challenges, a lot of shared challenges, not only from within Mexico, but from within other countries in the world. They have you Mexico, you Africa, you South Africa, for international global green challenges. So what they're looking at is looking at water management strategies. Yeah, this is very much water management and how all of this can be improved. And the other thing that's really important is social cohesion. What we're seeing rather is social discohesion. So, yeah, we need to be together as humans so that we can get to tackle those challenges that lie ahead of us. I'm going to start closing this. I encourage you. Um, we're going to be discussing the International Water Dialogues. This is an event sponsored from Water Europe, and so this is precisely about international relations and international cooperation on water. Also, the European Investment Bank is something I wanted to highlight. We're looking at Team Europe initiatives aligned with the European Investment Bank and Euroclima, which is one of the tools that are more important from Europe into Mexico. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm be more happy to address any and all questions or clarifications. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that your talk was important in terms of water framework directive, which is available with the table on the QR. So thank you for talking about your Pronatura project. Um, this was no accident, but rather this is having interaction online. Thank you for walking us through Natalie and co-creation and design. We have a few minutes for questions. And so I'm going to start with what's on site. And online, you also are encouraged to participate. I don't know if you have any questions for David. Hello, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. My question is about the Natalie project, which was interesting in terms of their scope. The last thing you mentioned with citizens, how are you measuring citizen outreach so that we get to gauge that impact we are looking after in society? Thank you for the question. This is a good question. I think that not only in the environment, but many other sectors, we find ourselves at this reflection point of how we can start measuring the impact we are having on in society. And so one of the ways we are doing this is, well, having already measured, already defined indicators for nature-based solutions. And so this will be helpful in knowing the impact we can have with your questions. So one of the other things we can start looking at in terms of social impact is what's called the theory of change. This isn't what we are doing in terms of the impact, but also this is helpful in thinking where the needs are and the actions that you can do are together with the local community so that we get to overcome those challenges. We have also other indicators that can help us measure this potential impact. Hopefully, I answered your question. Thank you, David Smith. Victor is still online. So, Victor Magaña. So, we might also take questions from them. Victor and David, I don't know if you would like to comment on both parties' speeches because you had the pleasure to listen to one another. So, yeah, I don't know if I can, if Victor can take the floor first. And we have, well, we have some more questions here. Yep. I think the level of action I found very interesting. I mean, the level of action in Europe and considering climate as essential policy and international relations. In particular, there is something I have always been very interested in. I don't know if you know the Green Belt project in the portion of Africa that's being reforested in order to prevent desertification. So I had the chance to interact with the French about this project, and I thought this project was very interesting because their studies where if reforestation is planned out, we can recover some rainfall. And I think this is good for Mexico because frequently we complain about desertification and the lack of rainfall. And I think there are ways in which science can give us solutions. And there are people who are willing to test out those solutions. So I would eventually like to consider an initiative for the case of Mexico because the northern portion of Mexico is always thinking as if they are always going through desertification, but which in reality is only arid areas. They've been telling us so for 25 years, but this is not true. So I think willingness by these groups is key. Hopefully, we'll be able to collaborate further. Thank you, Victor. If I may, I would like to answer this, to reply to this, because this I have liked a lot. And on top of this, what you said, I mean, is key because we need to be able to listen to local populations and very good ideas that can stem from this. Okay, so collaboration does work, and drafts by local communities can be implemented as this green wall, which was an initiative from the grassroots, implementing this plan after plant. And so this has been improving into a huge project. So these kinds of projects we can learn a lot from and start replicating elsewhere. But this is also about where this needs to be placed. So this is another important topic. Thank you, David and Victor. We have another question by the audience. Yeah, thank you, Fabiola Sosa by the Autonomous Metropolitan University. So, David, what kind of recommendations do you have in terms of funding alternatives for water body rescue projects spearhead by universities? Because one of the main constraints they're facing is funding. Traditionally, universities perform research, and there are instances for this. However, when building bridges and where the university is looking to have social advocacy projects implemented, we need to start knowing several funding mechanisms so that we get to promote and foster projects for ecosystem and water body preservation. Yeah, thank you. This is a question that's been evolving across these years because funding for universities and companies and communities facing these challenges is important. I know a couple of ways that might be interesting. The first is a research program in Europe that's referred to as Horizonte 2020. There are international cooperation and study cases to start learning and exchanging experiences across these two countries. We have two or more case studies therein. On the other hand, if you go with Team Europe Mexico, the website, there are a number of funding ways that can be found. And also the EEB. There is a lot of investment in terms of water and whatnot. With these three ways, there might be funding found and also with international cooperation within the European Union. Thank you, Fabiola and David. I don't know if there's another question for the audience to David Smith or Victor on funding, what means doing things right, a water framework directive, among others. Please go ahead. Hello, my name is Dana Mena. I come by Va por la Tierra, this effort. Thank you, David, for your talk. There's a lot of relevant information because regarding climate change and water, which we are interested in terms of its legal framework, I'm interested in knowing the fact that regardless of the fact that you know about the success stories and cases pulled into documents already available from the European Union, This has to do with current public policy making where citizens and communities, especially indigenous populations, have been neglected when implementing large scale projects. And so, how can have you been able to include citizens as part of this public policy making? Because in Yucatan has been a victim of water pollution, sinkhole pollution because of pork farms and so on. Because, yeah, meat is exported from Yucatan. So, how were you able to work out these challenges with multinational companies in the European Union so that we can tailor all of that in Yucatan? I am also empathetic of the youth, of indigenous youth involved in these kinds of large scale projects, and so with a resulting environmental impact and health impacts. I would like to hear from you in terms of that. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta
Thank you for the question.
por su perspectiva.
And thank you for your insights.
No es fácil, no es fácil.
It's no easy
La
task.
respuesta para
I mean,
zona,
the answer
cada área es
for
diferente.
each area will be
Porque las
different
políticas locales,
because
las
local
empresas,
policies,
las
companies,
comunidades son muy
communities
diferentes,
are all
en cada zona.
different
Pero sí que
depending on the
hay una
areas
manera que creo que
they're based
es
in,
buena
but they're
para todos
positive
los
ways
distintos áreas. Y este es de
for
identificar
a number of areas because they can all
los desafíos
find
que hay
the
y los intereses que
challenges
hay
or the
cada
interest
de cada actor.
by every
Por ejemplo,
stakeholder.
en Sudáfrica, yo soy
For
sudafricano.
example, I'm
En
South
Sudáfrica, en Ciudad del
African.
Cabo,
In
tenían
Cape
una
Town,
sequía durante
they experienced a
muchos
draft
años
for
y
many
llegaba a un
years,
punto que
and it
estaba,
came to a point
bueno, crítico. Y lo llamaban
that
day zero,
became
que
critical,
se
day
quedaban
zero,
sin agua. Y
right?
todo el mundo
The day
estaba
where there was no more water,
hubo en la
and
calle
everyone was with
para
their
sobrevivir.
buckets on the street,
Mucho
and
dinero, mucho
regardless of
dinero,
whether you had a lot of
demasiada
money, very few
lluvia baja. Todo el
money,
mundo estaba en la calle,
everybody was on the
desesperado,
streets
buscando
with
sus
their
50
buckets,
litros diarios.
looking at their
Diario,
50
diario, diario.
liters a day.
Situación crítica. Ahí hay un interés
And so
compartido
there is
entre
a shared
toda la comunidad,
interest
todas las empresas,
within the
todas las
community,
políticas. Porque
within all
de ahí se
policies
pueden
and
ir
companies. And
creando
so
unas nuevas
this is
leyes,
from
nuevas
where new
políticas,
laws and
nuevas
policies
maneras de
can be
gestionar el agua,
enacted
porque todo el mundo
along
estaba
with new water management ways because everyone was suffering from the same
y esto
crisis and the same issue.
encontrando
So
en
all of
muchos
that
otros
can be
sitios.
found
No hace
across
falta
many
irnos
other sites. I mean, we
que
need
todo el mundo
not
está en la calle
reach a
pidiendo
tipping
agua,
point where
pero se
everyone on the
puede
streets will
ir
be asking for water.
co-creando
Well, we can
soluciones
start
conjuntamente
co-creating
con las empresas, con
solutions
las
together with companies,
entidades políticas, con las
with political
civil
entities,
society organizations como
with civil
ustedes
society
y
organizations such as
diferentes
yours
organizaciones que
and
tienen
many other organizations
tema en común, que
which
es
have a
proteger
common
al
topic,
bosque,
which
que es
is
manejar
safeguarding
mejor el agua,
forests or better
reutilizar
water
de
management,
forma
water
mejor. Y este
reutilization, and
es
so on.
encontrar las
So
sinergias, los
we need to
intereses
be
de
able to
todos
find
y
synergies and
sentar a
everybody's
todo el mundo
interest in
en la
common. We
misma
need
mesa
everybody
y
needs to
hablar
sit
de las
down
cosas
in the
claras
same table
y
so we can speak
de
with
buena manera
candor
para que al final las
so
soluciones
that
sean compartidas entre
we
todos.
can share solutions.
Pues muchísimas gracias. Creo que un patrón que estamos observando es mucho el buen manejo y en este sentido también la gobernanza para todas las personas partícipes del agua que en este sentido somos
Yeah,
todos
this is
nosotros,
for
tanto
everyone
las
because we are all
comunidades,
partaking in water
las
with
empresas como el propio
communities,
ser humano. Entonces, en
companies,
ese
and
sentido,
everyone
creemos que
else.
estamos
So
avanzando
I
en este
think
camino
that we are down the right path towards dialogue. I don't know if anybody else has any questions for Victor or David or online. Do we have any more questions?
Si no hay preguntas, bueno, yo me permito hacer una ambos para Victor y para David Smith.
Okay, if I may, a question for both of you. After hearing from this, the types of drafts and everything can be done and the existing policies, could you provide two solutions? I mean, if you had a wish list for water and all the, considering all the data, so that the private and public sectors can mobilize, how could you have an ideal public policy that could be implemented, taking into account both context and the global scale of this issue?
¿Quién primero?
Who goes first? Victor, you may begin. Thank you.
Bueno, quizá yo insisto mucho en lo que
Well, I might
significaría,
insist on
hacer
what
uso
it
adecuado de la
means to
información
appropriately
climática, ¿no?
use climate
Con esto me refiero no
information.
solo a los diagnósticos
Not only am I talking
sino
about
también
the
a los
assessments,
pronósticos, ¿no?
but
No es
the
cuestión solamente de voltear y ver, ok, va a
forecasts.
llover o no va a llover. No, hay mucho más allá
It's not only about
hay
whether or
muchas
not
cosas en
we'll
las que
have
hay que
rain
trabajar
this year, but many
para
things
poder
to be
hacer
worked
un
on
buen uso de esa información. Y
so that this
creo
information could be
que eso
appropriately
ayudaría mucho.
used. And I
La
think this
otra
will be
es
really helpful. On
retomar
the other
algunas
hand, we
ideas
can
de
retake
reformar la Ley General de Aguas de México.
some general
Hay
law
muchas cosas,
reforms in Mexico, for example. I think that,
no quiero usar palabras muy fuertes,
I mean, I don't want to
extrañas, por
be
decirlo
so
menos, a la hora en que se dan concesiones, en que
definitive,
se
but you know, we need
dan
to
permisos para
assess
explotación,
permits for
etcétera. Entonces,
use,
habría que
concessions
reconsiderar
or
mucha de esa
licenses. So
política
all of that
en
needs to
términos
be
de a quién se
considered
le
in
da agua,
terms
para
of
qué se le
who
da agua, qué
is
efectos
given
tiene,
water
y
for
se tiene
what,
que,
their
se ha discutido mucho,
consequences,
¿no? Y
and
creo que hay
this needs to be
soluciones.
discussed.
Y
They
ahora a
are
lo mejor la
solutions,
pelota está en la cancha
and
de
maybe
los
now the
concesionarios.
ball is
Yo
in
creo
the
que
decision on the
no solo
decision
es
maker
pedir permisos, de
courts,
implementar y que realmente se reflejen resultados. Yo
so
a
that
lo
we can
contrario,
have
muchas de las
results.
noticias estas
And
de que ya el país prácticamente nos vamos a morir todos, lo cual es cierto, nos vamos a morir tarde o temprano. Pero
I mean,
yo
there are a
creo que
lot of
tenemos
very
todavía
tragic pieces of news, but I don't
espacio
think we're
amplio
at a tipping point yet. I
para
think we
hacer
have
uso
a lot of
adecuado
leeway
de nuestros recursos,
to appropriately
pero no podemos
use
seguir
our
implementando,
resources, but
¿no?
we
Yo creo que
cannot
todavía hay
further
que seguir
postpone
implementando y
this.
aunque sean
This
proyectos
needs to be
pilotos
implemented even in the form of
yo
pilot
creo que alguien
projects.
tiene que voltear a ver esos proyectos
So
pilotos,
these
todos son
projects needs to
exitosos,
be looked at
y hacer que esto se vuelva una realidad, ¿no? Yo veo
and
un futuro un poquito
make
más
this a reality. I
que
think there
algunos
is a kinder future
presentan con todo lo demás.
versus somebody else's opinions on climate change. Thank you, David.
Perdona, Regina, se me ha, que no escuchaba muy bien la pregunta.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question very well. Yes, the question is about what we've heard on using information, public policy making. So how would that public policy making be translated into a list for decision makers?
Ah, ya, la lista de reyes, ¿no? De tener las cosas que mejor que queremos. A mí me gustaría ver...
Yeah, this was about the bucket list. Well, I would like to see some changes
Han participado, ha tenido su voz y su voz
because everyone has
increíble
partaken in this. They
en
have expressed their voices, they made their voices heard in terms of what is to be done with our natural resources and so on. But I think that
muy pocos industrias, organizaciones o incluso políticos que han hecho lo que querían
a lot
con
of
nuestros
people
recursos
who've
y con nuestros
done
recursos.
whatever they
Entonces,
wanted
a
with
mí
our
me
own resources,
gustaría
which
ver
belongs to everyone.
este
I
cambio.
would like to see
Ya
this
que
change
estamos
happen
abriendo
now.
un camino,
I
estamos
know that
haciendo
we're
un camino
paving
mejor
the way,
por
a better
unos,
way towards
unos recursos bien compartidos.
very well shared resources. However, there is a lot to be done in many countries. And so, for my bucket list, I would like to see good management of natural resources as part of a country's policies done in everyone's best interest. Thank you. There are several questions online in terms of the approaches that can be taken with this information so that we get to better manage water, or how can these technologies include the relevant stakeholders in the basin. So first David and then Victor.
Yo puedo empezar con esto. Hay muchos distintos metodologías y procesos que
There are a number of
cada vez
approaches and methods which are becoming more and more prevalent and more key around the world. And this is a great thing to see. We didn't talk about the social business model or the theory of change. However, these methods and processes have been created and developed in the 90s, the 80s. However, today they are gaining more and more relevance and more success because these are societal models which have been created in the past where these topics weren't that interesting versus today. So these approaches, the social return on investment, are being used more and more today, and this is a positive thing. So I highlight a couple of examples from here. Thank you, Victor.
Bueno, yo lo que diría es que en México y en el mundo siempre estamos pidiendo rendición de cuentas en todos los sectores.
We are asking for accountability across all sectors, and it needs to be done even more so in the water sector. That is, how much is invested, how many results do we have, how efficient are these results? So, a while ago, we did a narration on the budget by the National Water Commission in Mexico. And so what we started to see is the how much it costed to realize a cubic meter worth of water. It so happens that with Conagua's budget, we would triple water availability in Mexico. This sounds kind of odd, but what's indicating is not the amount of money that's being destined, but how we are doing this in order for our problems to be solved out. So I think that money coming from Pronatura and other agencies and actions need to be done with accountability. Thing that needs this will allow people to know how well or how poorly resources are being managed. Just like I said, I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to show you how I painted my fence. I only invested 10 million pesos, right? No, I don't think you could tell this as expensive, right? So that'll be changed. There should be change, an attitude change, both from resource managers and accountability demanders. Thank you, David and Victor. And I think this is the end of this portion of the agenda. Right now, we're going to go back to the European Union. Thank you, David and Victor. Let's hear it for them.